What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 294 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about Seven Soldiers of Victory Volume 2. This is once again written by Grant Morrison with pretty much all the same artists that he was working with on Volume 1, with the exception of J.H. Williams III. You've got Fraser Irving, Cameron Stewart, Simone Bianchi, Mick Gray, who am I missing? Ryan Sook. So this collects the last two issues of Shining Knight and Manhattan Guardian, collects one issue of Zatanna and two issues of Clarion the Witch Boy. And one thing that Grant Morrison talked about in the foreword for Volume 1, he said that working with lesser-known characters, some of them are brand new, and then some of them are characters who existed but hadn't been used very much over the years. The beauty of using characters like that, as opposed to using some of the A-listers like Superman and Batman that he had worked on before, the good thing about working with these guys, he said, was that he wasn't obligated to have them be morally upright citizens. They didn't have to necessarily be heroic characters. He was wanting these people to be larger than life, but not necessarily heroic. With Batman and Superman, because of the franchise potential, and that's a word that Morrison used in the foreword, because these are characters who are going to be put on underoos and in cartoons and on lunchboxes, people who are much higher up in the company than Grant Morrison are going to demand that Batman and Superman act like heroic people more or less. They may have their own brand of heroism, but they're both going to be more or less good guys. But what's great about this is we get to see different levels of how these characters define themselves according to the word hero. For example, Zatanna and Clarion are two completely different people, polar opposites. Zatanna is trying to get away from the superhero life because she did some horrible things in the Identity Crisis storyline, and she recognizes that she did some horrible things, and so she's trying to get away from that life. She doesn't see herself as a hero. She's trying not to be a hero because of the bad stuff that she's done. So it's coming from a sense of morality that she's trying to bring back into her life. Meanwhile, you have Clarion, who doesn't see himself as a hero, and he's not really acting like a hero. The only reason that he takes any action in trying to save the people of Limbo Town is because Tikal, his familiar, basically is guilt-trapping him and saying, you know, hey, these are your family and your friends that you grew up with, you're going to have to save them. And if Tikal hadn't been his moral compass, Clarion would have let an entire village of people who live underground die for no real reason other than he felt suffocated and he was a little bit of a rebel. So it's interesting getting to see these characters go down different paths. Jake Jordan, he started off as being one of the most normal characters in the series, and I think even when you get into the last two volumes and you get to see the rest of the Seven Soldiers, Jake Jordan, the Manhattan Guardian, is still the most normal, grounded character in this series. But even he is starting to fill into his superhero role a little bit, I guess you could say. His wife slash, I guess it's his girlfriend, but they act like they've been married a while. She accuses him of loving this life too much and loving the danger and excitement of it. But he basically says, you know, this is just a job for me, and it's costing me my relationship with Carla. I don't want to do this anymore. So it's not necessarily that he wants anything bad to happen. He's perfectly okay saving people. He was a cop before, and his role as a Manhattan Guardian is very similar to being a cop. He's dressed very much like a cop who's part of a riot squad, so he sees himself that way still, but at the risk of his friends and family, he doesn't want to go down that path. So it's not necessarily that he's being selfish like Clarion, but it is coming from a sense of selfishness nonetheless. And then you have the Shining Knight, who is arguably the most heroic out of all of these characters. The Shining Knight just wants to do what's right and stop the bad guys. So I like that we get to see different levels of hero in this. Also, in the first volume, we were mostly just getting introduced to all of these characters, and the only real connective tissue was this invasive force from Fairyland, the Sheeta, and the Sheeta Queen, Gloriana. There is a lot more stuff connecting these minis now in this volume, and we're only halfway done. We've still got 3 more minis that are coming on, and a couple of minis that still haven't quite finished in this one, but it's so much more connected, and it feels like it is more of a big 30-issue mega series as opposed to 7 4-issue minis that aren't really connected. It feels more connected now. For example, we find out that there was an earlier version of the Newsboy Army, which is a thing in the Manhattan Guardian comic. We find out there was an earlier version of that team, and there are connections between the Zatanna comic and the Shining Knight comic and the Manhattan Guardian comic concerning the Newsboy Army. Also, there's a villain in the Clarion the Witchboy comic who is connected to Gloriana. There's a character in the Zatanna series who's also connected to Gloriana. I don't know if I mentioned this, but in Volume 1, we got to see these two dice. Clarion has one pair, or one half of these two dice, and the girl that Zatanna is taking on as an apprentice in the Zatanna miniseries, she has the other one. And that's a connection between those two books. There's a lot more going on here that connects these as one big overall narrative. And I cannot imagine whenever this was coming out, if somebody said, I'm a really huge fan of Zatanna, I want to read this 4-issue Zatanna miniseries coming up, and then they skip the Manhattan Guardian and the Shining Knight and Clarion the Witchboy, because there are so many connections between all these books that I almost think that reading this Zatanna miniseries by itself, you wouldn't be able to understand some things. For example, the Sheeta, they don't really show up in the Zatanna book until around issue 3. And then suddenly they're there, and Zatanna and Misty, they are visiting the estate of Don Vincenzo, the Undying Dawn, and he is a character who was very prominent in the Shining Knight miniseries, and then his backstory is given to us a little bit in the Manhattan Guardian miniseries, but I don't think that you could read any of these minis by themselves and not read all the others to understand what's going on here. It's not necessarily that events from one inform events in another, but you can read one by itself. It's really, this is all one giant story. It would be like reading chapter 4 of Harry Potter book 3 and not reading everything else. That's kind of what it feels like. And if this was collected in a different way, like you have the Zatanna miniseries collected by itself, and then the Shining Knight miniseries collected by itself, but then Morrison said you have to read all of these together, that would make me mad. But like I mentioned in yesterday's video, since this is all collected together like this, where you're just reading one volume, volume 2, volume 3, volume 4, etc., and you're reading it in the order that's presented to you, it doesn't make me mad. I really like the way that this is being done. It might have been different if I was reading this in single issue form, but the way that it's being presented to me, I think that it works very well. I like this series, I still like it, continuing to like the way that this series is presenting this story. This is an incredibly ambitious mega series, and I can kind of understand why other people haven't tried something like this, because while this is ambitious, I don't know if a whole lot of people actually liked this series very much. I love it, but I hardly ever hear anyone talk about the Seven Soldiers stuff from shortly before Infinite Crisis. But I like this quite a bit, still recommending this series. I still think that it's very interesting. Starting in Volume 3, we will be finishing up Zatanna and Clarion, and then we will be moving on to some of the other minis in the Seven Soldiers mythos. So look forward to that tomorrow. In the meantime, I am the Comics Kid 2099, and I will see you guys later. Have a good one.